Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you're here in person or whether you're joining us online on Zoom. My name is Arushika and I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event to mark the occasion of International Women's Day. So this event is being hosted by the Justice and Society Research Center. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the center's work, we focus on criminal and associated social justice issues in a range of institutional and community settings. So our members use participatory, creative, and rigorous research methods to work on gender, race, family, youth justice, probation, imprisonment, and victimization. So if any of those themes speak to you, please do reach out to us because we have a range of seminars and discussions that we organize over the course of the year. And many of those are open to people regardless of background and institutional affiliation. Today's event is titled Many Women, Many Feminisms, Varied Responses to Violence Against Women. And I'm really so excited to be joined by this esteemed panel who I'm going to formally introduce in a minute. But just some preliminary matters before. So if you do find any of the material we discussed today upsetting, if you go to the event page, there are a range of resources there, including NHS resources that you could use to gain some support should you need it. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that if you're leaving at the end of the event, you won't be able to leave through the main front entrance that you came in through. So please use the north door to exit. If you go to the ground floor, you'll see signs directing you to the north door anyway. If you need to use the bathrooms, then if you exit the room, you turn right and walk to the end of the corridor, you will find the toilets on your right-hand side. And if we do hear a fire alarm, it's definitely not a drill, so we will need to leave the room in that event. There are two ways of getting to the fire exits. So if you leave the room and turn left, you'll see one fire exit door on the left-hand side before the red door. Or you'll find the other fire exits, which are near the toilets towards the right-hand side. Okay, so with all of those preliminary matters out of the way, I'm just going to explain the format of the event a little bit in case people find that helpful. So I'll introduce the speakers in turn, and then as we go, I'm also going to give people the chance to introduce themselves in their own words and to share some of their research interests with you. Then about the first half of the event, up until about 4 p.m., I will monopolize the discussion and raise some themes and questions which I would like the speakers to focus on. We'll then take a 5-minute break, so you'll have the chance to process your thoughts and to gather any questions, comments, or feedback that you would like to raise in the second half of the event. And we're really looking forward to it being as interactive as possible. And having looked at the list of registered attendees, I know there's quite a lot of expertise in the room as well and on Zoom as well, right? So I know there are people with lots of research and practical expertise in this area, and we're very much looking forward to interacting with you in the second half of the event as well. So that takes us to about 5 p.m. and we then have a little drinks reception outside the room for those who want to stay on and talk to the other attendees, panelists, or organizers. So with that, I'm now going to introduce our first speaker for the day, Dr. Zainab Kaya. Zainab is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sheffield since 2020 and previously worked as a research fellow at the London School of Economics. She holds a PhD in international relations from the LSE. She is co-editor of Ivy Doris Bloomsbury's book series on Kurdish studies and co-convener of the Kurdish Studies series at the LSE Middle East Center. She is also an academic associate at Kendall College in Cambridge, and her main research areas involve borderlands, territoriality, conflict, peace, political legitimacy, and gender. Zainab has a monograph entitled Mapping Kurdistan, Territory, Self-Determination, and Nationalism with CUP, and has published several peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. So Zena, perhaps you would like to offer some introductory remarks as well.
So I am working, right? So hi everyone, it's good to be here. It's good to see you all, and happy International Women's Day to all of us. So if the bio implies, I have two different areas of research. One of them is the politics of the Middle East, and my gender-focused research is also connected to the Middle East context. So I'm interested in conflict, borderlands, and displacement, and these processes, how the relationship between individuals, communities, and the land and the space is established, and how this is politicized. So that's my kind of general interest, long-term interest. But then for the last 10 years, I've also been working on women's rights and gender, and looking into these questions from that lens as well. So my discipline is international relations, it's politics. So I know we will talk about the legal aspects of things, and I will refer to those aspects as well, but I'm talking mainly from a politics of gender perspective today. And in the Middle East, the main country that I focus on is Iraq. So I've been visiting the country for about 10 years. I have been conducting research in that context and worked with Iraqi researchers together as well. So we are basically trying to understand the changing politics of gender in Iraq since the intervention in 2003, and particularly focusing on women's rights defenders, women's rights activists, women's rights organizations, women-led organizations, and how they are navigating this post-intervention context, and how they are advocating for the causes that they have been advocating and the challenges that they are facing. So I don't want to talk too much about it. So we have right now we are working on a project specifically focusing on this, and particularly gender backlash. So I'll talk a bit about that and the challenges that we are facing due to the anti-gender equality agenda and gender backlash happening in Iraq. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Zainab. And our next speaker is Dr. Atisha Day. So Atisha is a senior research fellow at the University of Westminster. She is the principal investigator on the UKRI-funded research project, FEM Ideas, Decolonizing Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education. She is the author of Nirbhaya, New Media and Digital Gender Activism. She has been a vocal campaigner against sexual misconduct in higher education and is currently the director of International Knowledge Exchange at the 1752 Group. She is also the founder of the North-South Feminist Dialogue platform that aims to foster conversations and solidarity among activists and academics working on sexual and gender-based violence in higher education in the global North and in the global South. So Atisha, if you would like to say a few words as well.
Sure. Firstly, thank you for putting together such a wonderful people and bringing everyone together. Also, I mean, all of you don't know, but the panel does, that I've been going through a little bit of a personal emergency. So I want to thank all the panelists and the organizers for holding space for my grief in true feminist solidarity. So I really do appreciate that, and wanted to reiterate that, because we often forget that in feminist organizing is to hold space for care and grief within our movements. Happy International Working Women's Day to everyone here, but I think on this occasion, my heart and mind is with, wants to show solidarity with the women of Palestine who are fighting against imperialism, colonialism, and patriarchal violence. So just wanted to begin by sharing that solidarity. As Arushi said, so my work is, I started my PhD looking at digital gender activism in South Asia following the Nirbhaya movement, which many of you may be familiar with, in India in 2012. But as I was doing my interviews for that particular movement and speaking to activists, a lot of young women started sharing stories about university spaces and what was happening on campuses, which then led me to kind of reflect on my past time as a student activist in the university, but also current time as an activist within university spaces. And that led to my research around looking at sexual violence within universities in India, and right now expanding that project through the Femideas research project, to looking at South Africa, Nigeria, Argentina, and Brazil. So I just wanted to quickly also say what Femideas stands for. It basically stands for Feminist, Intersectional, Decolonial, Abolitionist, and Survivor-Centered. And we wanted to kind of put our guiding principles in our name so we can be reminded every day of what we stand for and what we are fighting for. So there are two very things that I want to mention very quickly before passing it back to Rushi. So the main aim of this project is to center survivors, which is very often not done in this research, and ask survivors what their needs are, what is their understanding of justice, what kind of accountability do they want, and kind of developing our research questions from that. So we have a lived experiences advisory group who actually kind of keeps us accountable and guides us through our research project. So we very much wanted to focus on being survivor-centered in every way possible. The other aspect, which was very important to us, was decolonial, or decolonizing the discourse. Because when I was doing my research in India, I realized that majority of the discourse in this issue is still focused on the global north, while some really radical and inspiring conversation around this is happening in the global south. So through this project, we're also kind of aiming to kind of disrupt some of these imperial geographies of knowledge production, and kind of develop more ethical, more equal, more horizontal research practices, which are centered on solidarity and giving back to the community. And finally, just to mention, because you mentioned the North-South Feminist Dialogue, it's a platform that I started in 2020 to basically foster this kind of conversations and solidarities. And our next panel, shameless plug-in, is on Monday, which is titled Silencing Sexual Misconduct in Academia. And on Monday's panel, we talk about publishing and responsibilities of publishers, coming at the back of a big case where and the concerns of the community, where survivors, when they spoke about their what happened to them, even anonymously, were shut down. So we're kind of talking about and trying to figure out the ethics of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Aditya. I'm sure the Monday event is in everyone's calendar already. And then we have Professor Miranda Horvath. Miranda is director of the Institute for Social Justice and Crime at the University of Suffolk, and a leading international researcher in the field of forensic psychology, specifically violence against women and girls. Miranda is co-editor of Rape, Challenging Contemporary Thinking, which is all over my reading lists, and the second edition of the Cambridge Handbook of Forensic Psychology, and has published numerous journal articles and reports. In 2020, Miranda founded the Violence Against Women and Girls Research Network, which brings together researchers providing opportunities to meet regularly, share ongoing, completed, and planned research in a supportive environment. Between 2021 and 2023, Miranda was the Pillar 1 Suspect Focus Investigations, academic lead for Operation Soteria Bluestone, a UK Home Office funded program designed to improve the investigation of rape and serious sexual offences, or RASO as it is known, in England and Wales. So Miranda, if you would like to share some more of your research in your own words.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm just thrilled to be on a panel like this, on a day like this. So happy International Women's Day to everybody. As you've said, I'm a psychologist by training. I'm a psychologist who's never been submitted for the psychology ref. I know we're all mad keen on ref. I've always been submitted in social work and social policy, and I think that tells you everything you need to know about how I work. It's applied psychology with a background in social psychology, but have also dabbled in sociology, criminology, and I think we're in for a really exciting afternoon of bringing all the disciplines together, and maybe just getting rid of disciplines, I think, as you said. Yeah. I think over my career, I've worked on lots of different areas of gender-based violence, and all of it has kind of had the working towards improving criminal justice responses. More recently, through Operation Satiric, and we were so bold as to say transforming criminal justice responses. And I will let you be the judges in the years to come as to how successful we were or weren't with that. As a psychologist, I'm really interested in looking at why and how people perpetrate sexual violence, particularly the experiences of victims, and the responses of those of us in society broadly. And I think that's another thing that's really important to me, that we often end up talking about the police or the something, but we are all collectively in this, and most of the attitude, behaviours and beliefs we all demonstrate in some way or another. I think as you very clearly said in my introduction, my other big passion and what I've done a lot of in my career is around bringing people together, around creating spaces where we can have sometimes difficult, sometimes awkward conversations, and creating spaces where that's okay and we can be respectful. And I really hope that we don't agree on everything this afternoon, and I think that'd be really lovely to have some of those conversations today. So if you're not already a member of the Violence Against Women and Girls Research Network, please join us. We are ever growing. We are got our third international conference in November. It's called For Abstracts Out at the moment. We'd love to have you come to Liverpool and tell us about what you're doing. It's really lovely. We have such a nice time. But related to that, I've been recently working more with Professor Helen Beckett and Dr. Tina Skinner, focusing on looking at research as well, because I think, as Virginie said, we're often not very good at looking after ourselves, and this work that we're really talking about are really difficult. And so we, Helen, Tina, and many others and I are really looking at how to put together guidance for PhD supervisors about how you should look after your PhD students when they're doing this work, how you should look after yourself, how we can get funding bodies to actually put money into bids for clinical supervision, whatever support, gym membership, whatever it is that you need. And so I hope that this afternoon, while we're having difficult conversations, we can also take care of each other, be respectful, and celebrate. It's tough, but there is a lot to be optimistic about, hopefully.
Thanks, Miranda. That's a positive note on which to start the conversation. So there are sort of three themes or questions that I wanted to raise over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. So my first question, and I'm going to ask this question in a very neat and tidy way, and then I'm going to meander and provide you with lots of grounding background for why I'm asking this question. So my neat and tidy question is, how does the relationship between cultural attitudes to women and the material conditions of women's existence manifest in your research? So, one reason I wanted to delve into this relationship between cultural attitudes and material conditions is because it is Women's Day, which was first started and celebrated as a socialist feminist holiday. But the seeds for this question also lie in my own research on rape prosecutions in India. So for those whom I haven't met before, a lot of my fieldwork has been qualitative fieldwork in Indian trial courts, specifically in Delhi. And during this fieldwork, I frequently came across examples of how legal decision-making was often influenced by discriminatory cultures or attitudes. But it was equally crucial to me to kind of grasp that a lot of the time, these attitudes were themselves normalizing the unequal and patriarchal distribution of socioeconomic power in society, including the unequal and patriarchal distribution of material wealth. And so I'll explain this maybe with an example, right? So very often when the sexual violence was alleged to be committed in response to the victim's claims on her housing rights, or demands that the victim had made, that the defendant should repay a debt that he owes to the victim. So often in these cases, the allegations were dismissed by state officials as being obviously false or being motivated by some kind of malicious motive. So their thinking was that, well, why is she more interested in safeguarding her property rights than she is in seeing the defendant sent to jail for rape? And on one hand, for me, this reflected sexist and discriminatory attitudes, which tend to assume that most or all women lie about rape. But on the other hand, it also represented a failure on the part of these state officials to grasp that rape is very often a tool, right? It's a tool to keep women in their place. It's a tool to normalize unequal distributions of wealth and socioeconomic power in society. So, I mean, my example talks more about how gender interacts with socioeconomic class, but equally we can, and I think we should talk about how gender can interact with caste, how gender can interact with race, nationality, and other parameters of inequality. And I do want to acknowledge one of our students, Nancy Dong, who specifically sort of encouraged us to focus on issues of gender identity and race. So, and of course, then, in the course of this conversation, if we are talking about intersecting structural inequalities, then we could also talk about the inequalities facing defendants or other people who are accused of sexual wrongdoing, whether that's through the legal system or through other sorts of institutional mechanisms. So there's lots to unpack here. So I'm just going to reiterate my original question, which was, how does the relationship between cultural attitudes to women and the material conditions of women's existence manifest in your research? And maybe, Sana, we can start with you, and then we'll go others on the panel. Yeah.
I mean, it's a big question, and my research has taken different strands over the last 10 years in Iraq. From women's rights organizations themselves to how cultural and tribal and religious community leaders and the norms that govern their interactions with their community members are kind of shaping the legal system and regulations the government has introduced, and how much these cultural, religious, or particular interpretations of culture and religion are perpetuating the existing institutional inequalities. But it's not a culturalist or religious explanation. It's actually, there's a lot of going on. Is socioeconomic structures, institutional structures in place, the kind of old legal institutions, some of which were introduced back in the British Mandate during, when Iraq was controlled by the British. During which, for instance, in the 1920s, the legal system, a dual legal system was introduced to apply to family law that pertains to inheritance, marriage, divorce, etc., for those living in the cities, in the urban areas, and then another kind of legal system to be used in the more kind of non-urban or rural areas. And that was basically done in collaboration or communication with the tribal or political leaders of the time that the British were talking with, and reflected some of the cultural assumptions about what the culture is like and what are the religious rules in that context. So that kind of, there is a lot of that political, socioeconomic kind of context of British involvement in Iraq 100 years ago left. There's a heritage there basically that is difficult to change in the legal system, because Iraq is also a very institutionalized kind of state. It's a very bureaucratic state, and it doesn't change easily. So there are still, after 2003 intervention, the 1948 personal status law is still in place. Some of the legal systems haven't been adopted or changed. And there's a massive bureaucratic system in place as well. It's very meticulously organized, everything, paperwork, and how things should be changed, how the laws should be introduced. And therefore, those type of institutional structures, legal structures, structural inequalities in place, throughout the time has been justified through various religious and cultural norms. So Iraq was not always a very, apparently, right, today we can look at Iraq and say, well, religion plays a really significant role in politics and the lives of people, especially with the wave of Islamization in the 1980s, 1990s in the Middle East in general. But then when you look at Iraq in the 1940s, 56, it's very different. So the way these institutional structural inequalities were not justified through religion per se, but through other things. So it's just constantly changing. So therefore, I think cultural attitudes is culture in quotation marks about what do we mean with culture. And the way I see culture is a lot of the time embedded in the socioeconomic structures in place rather than identity. However, in terms of intersectionality, for instance, another aspect of my work looked into sexual violence in conflict. And I worked on the Yazidi case after ISIS's attacks, and it was a 3 years project. It was very traumatic. I had to take occupational therapy after that process, and it wasn't really noticed. It wasn't really, I didn't know what I was going through. So there was a lot of traumatic experience that comes with that kind of research. But also this kind of idea of, you're doing that research, coming back to the UK in your comfortable life, and then feeling sorry for what's going on. It's such a, who am I to even feel sorry type of thing. It just feels very, you just realize the existing power dynamics in these contexts coming through in your personal kind of engagement with that research in that. And that makes you question a lot of the things that you're experiencing. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much about that, but in the case of Yazidis, for instance, they are a minority religious community, and living in the north of Iraq, their numbers are about 500,000, and ISIS deliberately targeted this group, arguing that they are the people of, they are not people of the book. So they are not Christian, they are not Muslim, they are not Jewish, so therefore they are a bit of a pagan, non-acceptable kind of religion, and they deserve to be, or they should be converted into Islam, and if they don't convert it, then these various acts are legitimate to inflict on them. So here we see this kind of, and they're kind of considered as an ethnic community as well, because they have been there for a long time. So they have distinct ethnic characteristics, different religious rituals. They have very different ways of doing things. Most important, they identify themselves as Yazidis and different from other communities. So this sexual violence in conflict happening in that context in a way that is intersecting with ethnic and religious identity. But at the same time, when you look at Yazidis, they have always been marginalized in Iraq. They are in the north of Iraq, where there is very poor infrastructure, very poor education, and most importantly, because of this dispute between the Kurdish and Iraqi government about the borderlands. What is the border in that context? There are disputes about who owns where. And Yazidis kind of, especially the Sinjar area, falls right in that ambiguous territory, which means none of the sides are necessarily taking much responsibility in terms of security protection, but also in terms of investments about infrastructure. So they were a vulnerable target for ISIS, an easy target. So neither the Iraqi army nor the Kurdish army necessarily went and protected them when they were facing what they were facing. So again, that's kind of this whole political context and the background and the socioeconomic investment in that context, and how they were supported. Like many of the women who were targeted in the villages, they are not literate. For instance, they haven't gone to school. I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about a particular group of Yazidi communities. Again, Yazidi communities within themselves are also have very different experiences of access to education and the opportunities and economic life. But this kind of not having education, not having literacy, not having money, mobility-wise, being away from the main cities and not having easy access, not knowing the geography, and all those things basically made them so vulnerable, that men and women, in terms of how they can protect themselves. So that's kind of, and sexual violence in that context is happening for various reasons, and we can talk about that later on. But it's basically a continuation of the existing violence in Iraq, taking a different form in that context. There's this continuum of violence, of normalization of violence against women in certain situations that has been going on for decades in Iraq. And this is just a different version of it, perhaps at a different level. They are all situated within that structural context. And I'm not, I need to stop, I know. I just want to.
No, sorry, I didn't. I thought you were pausing naturally. Yeah, go on.
I just let you. No, I just stop.
I have all day. No, I was just gonna say that's quite a different context from like my own research, which is focused more on the legal systems. I think Aditya, it would be interesting to hear from you as well because you work more in university context. So
Sorry, I was like focusing so much on your talk, I forgot that I had to talk. This is so interesting. But I was like, I want to reiterate your dilemma is like an almost everyday dilemma for me as well. Like, dealing with your own traumas that comes as a result of the research, but also just like almost invisibilizing it because you're like so much better position than many of the people who are part of your research community. So also acknowledging that privilege at the same time. But yeah, again, like, this is a really broad question. So I'm going to try and answer it like specifically based on my work and some of the things that we found. So like, again, it's decolonization and intersectionality are the names of our project and our two core values that we are really, really committed to. And so I'll start with the decolonization aspect of it, which kind of ties into the rest. And, when we started thinking about what does decolonial research mean, and in some ways, like I actually started like not liking using the term decolonial because it's kind of like been robbed of its political potential in certain ways. So then when we started thinking about it, we were like, okay, we don't want to be that decolonial project which uses two black or brown scholars and say that we have decolonized. But then think about what does it actually mean in practice? And to us, then it meant like following like Black feminist thought or Indigenous scholars and actually thinking about ways in which we can actively restructure, redistribute, reimagine, and rebuild. And that kind of led us to think about intersectionality as well, more structurally and more politically. And look at hidden and also visible power dynamics which exist within universities. And it was very important to talk about the hidden power dynamics. And one of the hidden power dynamics, for example, was caste in UK. And just to kind of like give you a bit of a background, like when I talk about this as a researcher, but also as an activist in this, who's kind of worked with student complainants, worked in policymaking within universities and within activist movements. So, while this is a very visible power dynamic in South Asia, when you kind of talk about caste in UK campuses, people are like, well, we can't do anything about it because it's not included in the Equalities Act. Why it's not, it's a very interesting story for another day, but it has to do something with right-wing forces in India. But we've had complainants from South Asia who specifically said, we want to file a complaint of gender-based violence within higher education, and this has to do with our caste. And universities have failed to understand what caste has to do in that context. So then it's important in terms of doing an intersectional research in this area to actually look at these hidden power dynamics, which are often not spoken about, but also then looks at what does decolonization mean in that context. It means visibilization of discourses of caste within imperial academic institutions. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is also we understand gender-based violence in higher education as something which is deeply interconnected with other forms of violence, such as imperialism, histories of colonization, with precarity, with neoliberal marketization, with racism, with other gender-based attacks. And in the way we say it is like all violence is related, and you cannot solve or even begin to address gender-based violence within higher education unless you look at all these different interconnectedness of it. And one of them, which was just, is something that we have like highlighted right from the beginning is the questions of precarity. There has been a lot of writing around how precarious members of staff are the ones who are targeted the most, and how people on the most precarious contracts obviously find it difficult to kind of speak out about such violence. And then in that case, what we try to do in our work is to kind of form these links between gender-based violence and precarity, and gender-based violence and class, like you were talking about. The other very interesting thing which comes up again and again in our research, and I would say it's often invisibilized in places like the UK, is our questions about visa and relationships with the Home Office. So in quite a few campaigns that I was involved in, the people who were targeted were international students who were on visas, which made it almost impossible for them to go through any criminal justice mechanism. So when they went to the university said, we can't do anything, please go to the police. But they can't go to the police because they're like, oh, so when we apply for our visas, we need to declare if there is an ongoing police case against us. Does that hamper our visas? What happens, right? So then they are stuck in this like space of where they feel like they have nowhere to go. And these are, I think, very like often invisible dynamics which we don't think about when we talk about sexual violence within higher education. And this not only in the context of research, but also goes then in the context of policy making. It goes in the context of activism. How do we build policy which includes these demands? Like one of the things that I hear most in terms of like complainants going through mechanisms within universities is that, sorry, I have to miss days of work because of this. Can the university compensate us? So one of our main demands when I was campaigning with students was for just financial compensation to pay for train tickets, to come and appear for hearings. Again, these are things which are not spoken about, not only within like policymaking, but also within activist movements of like our movements need to be intersectional in the way that it actively takes into consideration like material dynamics and material needs of survivors. But also, I'm going to say one last thing, and I am going to stop, I promise, because you did very briefly mention about that we need to then consider the question of intersectionality when we look at perpetrators as well. And I think that is so important. And, studies have shown, for example, in India, like over 70% of people in prisons on death row are people lower caste and lower economic backgrounds. The majority of people in the US prison systems are from marginalized communities. And that kind of says something about mechanisms and institutional mechanisms and who they serve and who they protect and what they protect, right? Often it is something that stays with me deeply, deeply, is that when I was doing research in South Africa, and a survivor told me, if I call the police today and I tell them somebody came in and broke my couch, they will come and arrest him immediately. If I tell them I've been raped, they will do nothing. So a couch is more important than my body. And based on that, we did start to think about how to develop more abolitionist approaches to dealing with sexual violence within higher education that actually focuses on what you were talking about and actually changing these attitudes towards gender and then sexual abuse. How can we think about creating these like structural and cultural changes, which include no more precarious contracts on one hand, to creating better gender dynamics, gender relationships on the other, but also how to prevent these things happening, how how to rehabilitate people within the system and bring them back into the community, and think of all of that through a deeply, deeply intersectional lens. I'm going to stop here. Sorry. That was so much. I was tired of hearing my own voice.
I kept thinking I knew what I was going to say, and then you say something else. I was like, oh, well, maybe I could. I'm so excited. I will be short. I think I just wanted to go back to something I said in the beginning of this. A lot of my work has been around why people do what they do, but also looking at how we understand what we do. And what really, throughout all of my years doing this, constantly surprising me is how actually little understanding there is about who victims are, who perpetrators are, what just rape, just take that, what it actually is. And the fact that we are still having conversations about, I think you were talking about consent, like what actually consent is. And one of the students said, oh, what does consent mean in this context? And so I just wanted to draw on really area that we looked at in operations theory research. Bearing in mind that this is all looking at police data and cases that are made. So you all know that most of them don't get this particular. But from the data we had, so we had 5 police forces gave us all of their cases from the last 3 years, so thousands and thousands of cases, got massive data sets. And we did interview case reviews where we got actually officers to review cases that their colleagues had done and reflect on those, and then more senior officers to review and reflect on those. So we've got that real ultimate ability to triangulate, which one always hopes. One of the things that came through very in the interviews was that officers don't understand all those things. They don't understand what rape is. They don't understand what consent is. They don't understand that anyone can be a victim. They don't understand that anyone can be a perpetrator. A lot of them still, when we ask them, mentioned soon have you training on rape myths and those kind of things, they would say, what's that term? Not even recognise it. But then you would have those who would say, oh yeah, I've been to that training, I know that, and I know what a rape myth is. And then in the next sentence would be describing a case where they were just rape mything all over the place. So that lack of ability to reflect and understand how their own thinking is so faulty, and then to link to what effect might this have on the investigations that I'm conducting was completely missing. And my colleague Anna Jakowski and Joanna Ferrier, who's wrote a really brilliant article drawing on those interviews from just one police force, which is an international victimology last year. Just shout out to other people. But then I also wanted to draw on another colleague on the project, Rosa Lopez-Heimer, has done some really interesting work looking at the ethnicity breakdowns of victims and perpetrators in these data sets. Showing that, as you would, no one's going to be shocked to hear that the ethnicity of the victim affects the outcome. Shocking. But do you know what? A lot of this data isn't there. What we found time and time again is that simple things like ethnicity, like relationship between the victim and perpetrator, weren't recorded. So the police don't even know what they're looking at. Some of that recording is human error. It's not just not there. Some of it is they don't think it's relevant. Now, how are we meant to develop the understanding if the data isn't there? What we also saw in the case reviews that I mentioned, and Rosa and a few of the other members of the team analysed in more depth, was to look at what it really looks like in an investigation. When you have a minoritised victim, what does that mean that the officers do or don't do differently? And you can see that they don't, for example, they often provide an interpreter in honesty. Some of that's resources, some of it they didn't even think about the issue. They aren't signposting routinely to relevant buy and force services to support victims after they've reported. So some of that is ignorance, some of it's lack of training, some of it's will. The final thing, to just bring it back to perpetrators that I wanted to talk about from this data, was that suspects, perpetrators, they're everywhere. They're anybody. But the officers showed us time and time again that they didn't have the awareness of that. They didn't understand, for example, and we looked at analysing their data, between 19 to 45% of suspects in that police data were repeat suspects. Yeah, so they've been accused of previous sexual offences. That's just for sexual offences. If you then looked at any criminal offences, any kind of one, that went up to almost 66%. So these are suspects that they know who they are. They're in their data sets, and they are still not able to see that this person would think, actually, we did this because the faulty thinking that the initial thinking is, well, women are. So what I'm dealing with here, my culturally ingrained attitude, is that this is a crime where the most likely scenario is the victim is still alive, and that is exacerbated if you then add in any issues of any kind, other kind of intersecting fact. I'm going to stop.
No,
So
no,
we move
thanks
on.
for that. Yeah, I mean, I think what these responses are showing, I think the true spirit of the research center is very entrenched link between criminal justice and social justice across a very wide range of countries and in institutional contexts. So no, that was
I suggest a book.
yeah.
Just following
Yeah.
on what you were saying.
Such a
I'm reading like Dina Nairi. I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly. Their recent book called Who Believed. And it's beautiful because, not even beautiful, it's heartbreaking. But it kind of talks about some of these issues that you're talking about, but within, like, with also the medical profession, what happens when a survivor goes to the hospitals, or when someone's incarcerated, goes to the hospitals, or through these various institutional systems. And it's given me a lot to think about.
Okay, thanks, Adrija. You can see me furiously make notes of all your suggested events and books, but I wanted to shift gears a little bit. And another theme which feels sort of impossible to avoid in the current moment in time is the interaction of violence against women with technology. And so my second question is, in what ways does technology shape violence against women and also responses to violence against women? And from my perspective, there are moments of real hope, which we saw with the Me Too movement and other similar social media movements. Particularly, I think for those survivors who are not interested in the sort of limited menu of options that's being offered through the criminal justice system or other sorts of institutional mechanisms. But it's impossible to overlook the kind of silencing effect of trolling. In many parts of the world, there are outright internet shutdowns, and that makes feminist mobilizing really impossible, or any kind of mobilizing and activism very difficult. There are people who've come across advocate and sort of avenues for really unleashing the unbridled misogyny through the use of internet fora. And of course, in this country, we've all kind of read the headlines around the murder of Diana J, where also technology played a really crucial role in shaping the choices made by the people involved in that case. So really, how should feminists feel about the liberatory possibilities of technology? And I was actually, this was a bit of a revelation to me that Adrija's background is actually in computer science before she started discipline hopping. So maybe you can kick off this discussion around technology and violence against women.
God, don't study computer science.
That's my main takeaway.
It was shit. Clearly, I'm not a computer scientist anymore. But what 3 years of studying computer science did was to really, or rather, the only thing it did was to start this keen interest on people's relationships with technology and how people are using technology. So this is a really interesting question because when I was doing my research in India, and I recently actually wrote a paper on online sexual harassment in Indian universities, and I went at the back of Me Too movement, right? So I expected a lot of conversations around the liberatory aspect of it, which there was, but there was also the harassment and the violence aspect of it came up again and again. And while I think there has been in the UK, there has been some focus post-COVID on online harassment more generally. But what happens is that then online sexual harassment, which is very specific, gets lost within that broader focus of online harassment. And the other thing that happens is that online harassment is also very easily dismissed because people think that it's not bodily, physically related. But what my research finds, and a lot of other research on this issue finds that, like how survivors describe their experiences is very much physical. And the implications of it is also very much physical. It's very much economic. It's financial. So there is an urgent need to take it seriously, but also understand it from a more nuanced perspective. So one of the things that come up again and again in my research is image-based sexual abuse. And I specifically use the word image-based sexual abuse and not revenge porn because there is, literature to say that that's always not based on revenge, and there are various other dynamics to it. But in my research, I have found that image-based sexual abuse is used as retaliation in certain relationships within universities. One person actually described to me when describing their experiences said that they found that their online sexual abuse was more traumatic than any form of real life, if you can even make that distinction, because they felt like because their phone was the medium of their abuse and they were carrying their phone with them, it was almost like it was, in the Donna Haraway term, it was like it became a part of them, like the machine and the human kind of became part of the same, and hence the violence became the same as well, and they felt like they were carrying their violence with them, which was in some ways eye-opening for me. The other thing that came up again and again was chat rooms, online chat rooms, toxic chat rooms, locker room chatting. And this is something which has been really prominent in UK academia as well, with toxic chat rooms being uncovered in Warwick and Durham. My participant said that in many cases, the university administration knew about these chat rooms. They merely asked people to step away from them if it was disturbing, or as one person said, why are you saying these things publicly? Just say it in your own groups, right? Just don't put it. So, and in all other cases, they focused on covering it up to save face rather than actually have these difficult conversations around toxic masculine culture within universities. The third thing which came up actually the most in my research was trolling. And there were two kinds of trolling. So trolling by misogynistic gender trolling, when people came out to talk about their experiences of harassment or abuse or sharing stories of harassment or abuse, it was often other male friends of perpetrators who kind of ganged up on them. But in the case of India, it was also very, very often state-sponsored, systematic right-wing trolling directly targeting feminist activists on campuses. And I could talk so much about it, but I am going to I'm going to stop, but I'm going to just mention, my analysis and understanding of that based on my research is that we understand online sexual harassment, something which is far away, something which is happening in a different space, and hence does not have material consequences. But how I see and there is a growing writing around that, is the urgent need to kind of develop a more materialist understanding of what online sexual harassment is and what the consequences are. And I write about online sexual harassment almost as witch hunts. So we know the advent of capitalism saw the witch hunting of women and silencing of women in a certain way, online trolling of women in India have been repeatedly termed as witch hunts. And we need to think of online trolling and online sexual harassment as witch hunts and silencing and disciplining of women, which at the end of the day profits both patriarchy and techno-capitalism. So I'm going to stop here and then.
I have two completely unconnected thoughts. It is not normal for me. But one of the things that struck me thinking about what you say about technology was thinking back to work over 10 years ago with some brilliant master students and Peter Hegarty, where we wanted to look at whether people could tell the difference between what lads mags said about women and what breaks said about them. Basically, thinking about the frame of lads mags the time as normalizing these abusive thoughts and derogatory opinions about women. And that piece of work ended up being used in a lot of the activist works around the loose lads mags. And some of you will be just saying, what is a lads mag? Because you're so young, it's so lovely. But what struck me about that, which was really exciting at the time, it was like research into activism and back and forth, and that was really exciting. But whilst one could celebrate that actually lads mags in their paper form disappeared, it didn't. It just went online. All of those things, attitudes, beliefs, they just went online. And I think we need to be really careful that we don't forget kind of basic understandings around power and control and coercion, that we know about how sexual violence and sexual abuse happens in the real world. And that actually most of those underlying motivations and mechanisms are very, very similar. It's very effective to say that it's just a different context for all of those behaviours. And I think we would be foolish to not draw on that understanding that we already have in these contexts. But I absolutely encourage you to be more of the expert. My other thought is completely at the other end of the spectrum, and I'm going to be very careful because I'm going to say something which I may live to regret. But another area of work I've been looking at more recently is around the use of algorithms in policing. And there's a lot of movement, every police force wants an algorithm to help them work out who their high harm perpetrators are, or where they should be prioritising this, that, and the other. And often that is around high volume domestic violence cases and stalking and things like that. And some colleagues who've been working on a project recently, we've been trying to get police forces to think about how can you do this ethically? What do you actually want to do? Because a lot of police forces, a lot of senior officers say, well, we must have an algorithm, everyone's got an algorithm. No understanding of, well, what's the point in it? You know, you would never start a research project and say, what's the aim of this? What are we trying to get to? And then you're going to identify a group of people. Well, what's she then going to do about that? You know, you are then, they potentially, heaven forbid I say something nice, but they're then leaving themselves exposed to all kinds of, well, you didn't take action, you know that this person's done this 14 times, and you had him on your list. And I think that we have a responsibility here to point out where some of the tools they're using actually don't work for violence against women and girls, for those gender-based violence issues that we know about. So I'm going to get shot at. But for example, the Cambridge Harm Index, there is emerging evidence, it's quite a lot of it to say that it really doesn't capture the harm of rape, of domestic violence, domestic abuse, all these kind of topics that we're talking about. But that is what these algorithms are being based on. I'm going to stop now because I'm probably about to be sorted off.
God, I don't like being the first speaker because yes, like now I want to speak about this and now I don't know what I'm going to say. And I don't really work on technology, but in our work in Iraq with 3 organizations on the ground in Baghdad, one in Basra and in Erbil, we conducted research on which we didn't publish, but we did the research on shelters and how women are reporting their sexual abuse and how they're seeking legal advice, and obviously increasingly so I've been working there for 10 years, but especially in the last 5 years, the online harassment cases, the numbers have really increased significantly. And obviously the Iraqi legal system is not necessarily able to respond to that kind of challenge. Most of the time they don't even see it as a problem. They don't have mechanisms to deal with that. Like in the investigations, how the evidence about online social media or online harassment or death threats, etc., are being restored and kept. There are lots of problems with that, and lots of people's identities are being exposed, or the evidence is being collected in a way that's not necessarily leading to proper investigation. So there's a lot of procedural issues in the ways in which these types of harassments are processed. Also, there's no legal context for online harassment to be considered as a crime. It doesn't exist in that way. Only whenever it becomes into an actual act of violence or death or femicide, etc., then it becomes part of the evidence pool. So there are lots of issues there, but the technology has become, in Iraq particularly, rather than a space for solidarity now, as a space where the government can infringe upon them, control them. Hate speech is escalating. Loads of military, tribal, political parties and groups with lots of money are pouring money into these channels on Telegram and producing these really flashy videos about women who are going wayward and what happens to them, type of thing. And the public is eating them up. They are really watching them. In one of them, which I watched when I was last time in Baghdad, and it was unbelievable. So there is a domestic violence law presented to the parliament since 2015, and conservative MPs have been preventing that from being passed as a law. So it's been like almost going to be 10 years. And it is still waiting to be passed. And this has become a very controversial issue, especially now, because there's this gender backlash happening in Iraq. And what I mean with gender backlash in that context currently is that the concept of gender is being banned from being used. And civil society organizations, women's rights organizations have received letters, and they were asked to come to the Ministry of International Organization to sign a paper to say we are never going to use the concept of gender in our work in any place, otherwise we face closure. And international organizations have kind of not really provided support on that, because many of the projects they are doing are funded by international organizations, UN, and international donors, and those are taking of their logos and the support from these local organizations. And the reason is that, the idea is that because gender is associated with LGBTQI, and that's a very taboo issue in Iraq among the conservative parties, and therefore they are using that as a soft spot to hit the women's activism, basically good old patriarchy, targeting LGBT, but actually targeting the women's rights movement through that. So gender concept is banned. There is a ministerial office, a cross-ministerial office called Women's Empowerment Department in Iraq. And now they also don't like the concept of empowerment in that name of the ministerial office. So Women's Empowerment Department, as of 2 days ago, now is the Iraqi National Women's Affairs. And then on top of that, they also advise, this is not a legal rule or an official norm, but they advise not using gender equality. They want to use gender justice, whatever that means, because equality is not. So, and this kind of rhetoric in these Telegram channels, the issue was that as part of this gender backlash, that gender backlash is really happening in the social media through these channels. People are being bombarded with this information. They are saying, if you don't want your daughter to come home with a boyfriend, you should not support the domestic violence law. Or do you want your wife to go and have boyfriends elsewhere? You shouldn't be allowing that. And the context is that the legal rules have the obligation of the husband to punish the wife if she doesn't obey the rules, and the children, so the wife and the children. So it's part of the legal system. So they, if they commit crime or rape, marital rape is not even an issue. So the legal system is providing this pretext for these conversations to be seen as normal, as accepted. And this is all happening in the social media and reaching to wide audiences. Online harassment is an issue as well. Targeting of women who are active in social media. Women's rights organizations are now taking off their work office addresses, names from their websites so that they don't get targeted in that context. So online, the internet has become a very dangerous place. So the space of feminist solidarity in this space is just becoming smaller and smaller.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting to reflect on. I think Atisha pointed this out at the start also, like how separate is this kind of binary between online and offline. So thanks for sharing your insights again. I do realize we just passed pause, even though I have a third burning question to ask. I'm going to propose we take a 5-minute break now, if that's okay, and then we can come back and I can reveal my third and final question and also invite reflections from the audience. So yeah, we reconvene in 5 minutes. Thank you. I know it's been excruciating for everyone to not know what my third question was, so I'm just gonna come on and ask it. And I mean, we touched on this on the while discussing the previous question, but I wanted to ask a more general question about sort of feminist resistance and solidarity. So not just in the digital world, but more broadly. And my own kind of entry into feminism also happened in the aftermath of my own experience of sexual violence, where I felt that where there's no other type of scholarship which is actually giving me the resources to understand my affective experience either during or after the incident. And so against this background, I was actually quite struck by some of Aditya's work, where you talked about how various people who participated in the Me Too movement also talk about their disclosures leading to the formation of these feminist networks and communities of support. And in a very different way, I think, Zainab, you've also touched on how when like survivors of sexual violence in the conflict, when they started coming back into the community, this also posed a kind of reckoning or grappling with now how should our faith be interpreted to accept these survivors back into the fold, or to foreground women's education, or think of ways in which gender-based inequalities can be mitigated. So I guess my broader question is, how might we channel the rage and confusion that results from gender-based violence to build feminist movements and solidarities? And maybe Miranda, you can take us off, and then the others can pick up.
We'll keep it concise, right? We want to hear from all of you. I'm sure you've got lots of comments and thoughts. I have so many things I want to say, but I think I found it really helpful something Judith Butler said a few years ago, which was that the most important issue is to make coalitions where we did not think there was. And I think that's, for me, the starting point of this conversation. Because it's not to say it won't be difficult. It's not to say that there won't be, obstacles that seem that we would never get around them, but it is possible. And ultimately, I really honestly believe everyone in this room, everyone on this panel, we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to break down the oppression, the discrimination, everything else. We might have different ways of doing it, but that's a strength, not a weakness. And I also think we have to allow space for the rage and the anger. It's healthy, it's helpful. We are taught as women not to be angry, and it seems a problem if you're an angry woman. That's completely wrong. We know that. So I think there's good trouble, there's good anger, and then there's that point of saying, but we must not let it consume us. And I know on Operation Satyria Bluestone, Joanna again because she was involved in that project, but the scale and the enormity of what we are facing was overwhelming at times. And we built clinical, individual and group supervision into that project because we knew that that was going to be the case. Despite that, it was overwhelming. And so that's where I think, we have to work together. We have to work collaboratively. We have, said it already with the Violence and Girls Research Network. We do that in that research space, right? But what we actually found was as soon as we set it up, we had practitioners, activists, we had, very few spaces end up being exactly what you think they're going to be. And I think we have to embrace that and embrace those changes. I also want to just finish by saying, again, about looking back and about learning from the past. And when we did the second edition of Rape Challenging Contemporary Thinking, we asked Jan Jordan and Rebecca Campbell to look back on their careers and revisit earlier work. Rebecca Campbell in particular went back through all her research diaries and thought about that kind of emotional involvement, thought about the impact that her work had. And I think we need to make space for that, because it's not always transformative. Sometimes it's tiny, tiny steps forward, but they're all successes we should celebrate. And also touching on, I really admire your honesty about where you came from, how you got to this. And there were two personal reflections, and one of which was being a really young girl. I grew up in Suffolk on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and going to the library in the nearby town. And I read all the Barnstead and Morgan's Tales of the City books from the age of like 11 or 12. And this week I saw him in conversation with Russell Tovey, and my life is now complete. But those books, the understanding of being queer, of all of the things that he talks about, and also about being a feminist. Strange that some of that should come from a middle-class white man, but it spoke to me and it gave me some hope. And then at university, reading Against Our Will by Susan Brown, and suddenly everything makes sense. I was like, whoa, you know, and whatever it is for you, and that's that. I'd love to talk to you all about over wine. What was that for you? Where did it come from? Because I bet there's lots of overlap, but that's where our strength comes from. So, Robin's next.
I'm the second this time. I mean, there's always hope, and I think in terms of the level of trauma, your own personal experience, and thanks for sharing it with us, and how what we deal with that rage. I totally agree with you. We need to have space for rage and anger, and we need to express it. And it is empowering. It is transformative. It also, I think, speaks in a different way about the issue, and I think it's important that it comes out in that way as well. But what I want to, so it totally agreeing with that. Moving on to another point, and I don't know what that point I was going to make, but I think so. You referred to the sexual violence in conflict case, so. In response to that, obviously, I'm not in a place to talk to how women who experienced that trauma felt and what their feelings were like, apart from what they have told me. And this was a systematic kind of violence that entailed killing of certain community members, taking of children and turning them into soldiers, separating families, taking women, using them as domestic servants in the house, but also abusing them sexually and using all other forms of violence as well against them. So gender-based violence in all its forms, you know, all included, and targeted on a particular community. And this community has this history of collective trauma anyway. So they would say, well, what we experienced in the hands of ISIS was our 74th genocide. Over the last about 800 years, they have recorded all of this, and what they experienced in the hands of their local or imperial rulers, whoever was running the territories that they were located. And so with that, so there was this, they were unbelievably calm when I was speaking with them, and the community members as well. There is this, like this. We are familiar with this. We know this kind of thing. This is all happening again, and we know what it was like. And then this collective sense of shared experience was giving them a lot of strength at present, but also the sense of collective sharing of trauma going back to these, because this collective trauma and remembering of collective trauma has also become part of their identity, of their current identity anyway, even before what happened in 2015, 16, in that period. And the other thing that was interesting about so it was very important to try to understand how the community is trying to deal with this. So one of the things that came out is that, never again, which we hear a lot, right? After genocides or after big traumatic experiences, never again. How do you prevent this from happening again? So loads of women and mothers and elderly started to prioritize the girls' education. If they knew how to call us on the phone, we could have helped them. If they knew they could read the directions, they could have escaped. Like there were lots of practical things that they could have done, they couldn't do because of this. So we need to educate them. We need to make sure that they are equipped and are ready to be able to protect themselves, because men can't always protect them, and we are living in a different world. So that was kind of a way of coping with it. But in terms of their personal experiences, children born of war is a big issue, and lots of Yazidi women were pregnant from their ISIS captors, and they wanted to bring their kids to the back when they were rescued. They wanted to bring them, and community didn't accept in most cases, because to be a Yazidi, both your parents have to be Yazidi, and this is a child who wasn't, the father wasn't Yazidi. Moreover, was perpetrator of violence, and through their community members. So that whole political conflict context really was embedded in the body of this child, and the mother was kind of in this place of so that was an issue. So maybe with sexual violence, they were kind of trying to heal through collective solidarity and support, and trying to look at the future, which doesn't really even represent what they have gone through. This is like, I'm trying to say, how they do the solidarity, but when it comes to the children, it was like it didn't work out. So, but yeah, I had one more point, but I can't remember it. So
We can
I'll
come
stop
back.
now.
Yeah.
Third speaker because this sucks.
So I keep hearing.
You never know, will you? Feminist rage is excellent. Just want to foreground that, as all the other speakers said. I have been called out several times for being an angry brown feminist, and I'm very proud, very, very proud to be an angry brown feminist. But the thing that I have started asking people who call me an angry brown feminist is that, why are you not angry? The world is going to shits. I'm angry. I'm angry to see precarity, to see poverty, to see, the gender pay gap in our universities, to see how certain things are taught and not taught, to see about the violence on certain bodies, to see the attack on people. Why are you not angry? And then from that, kind of think about, what is the privilege that protects you from being angry? Because I'm very, very angry right now. The second thing again is I can't agree with you. Can't agree with you. I agree with you so much. Sorry, it's later Friday. I've forgotten how to speak English. When you say that the importance of having a difficult conversation, and I say that as somebody who writes on too, and people are like, oh, you cancel culture people. And I think here it's a very, I draw a very important line between cancel culture and call out. Calling out people is important, especially calling out powerful people is important, because it's a disruption of power. It's a disruption of power dynamics. And it's been a tool that has been used by the feminist movement for a very, very long time. And it can be a very productive tool to ask people to be accountable, and then from there to make amends to that and to address that harm. I do not, however, believe in calling out people, in canceling people and saying that you have said something wrong and we will never speak to you ever again. Because can any of us in this room put up their hands and say that they have never made a mistake in their lives? And I believe that I am today a better feminist, a better comrade, a better academic, because other feminists, colleagues and comrades and allies have put in that labor, that love into having difficult conversations with me to say that, Rija, what you said was, maybe you need to deeply think about that. And I think it's made me better. And I think the space for these kind of conversations are becoming very, very, very small. And again, going back to what Audre Lorde said, that sometimes within movements, we don't all have to agree with each other, and that is okay. We have to think about how we can pull in those differences and build stronger movements. So that difference often needs to become our strength, because at the end of the day, we are working towards a better future, like you've pointed out. And in the same way, lots of, I spoke to women who wrote online testimonies after the Me Too movement in India, and basically asked them, why did you choose to go online? Why did you publicly choose to speak about such, really private things? And one of the things that they said was because they wanted healing and justice and accountability, and none of the available processes actually provided that. Some of them said that the only thing that could happen through an institutional process would be the worst thing would be like the dismissal of their perpetrator, who was from a lower caste background, considering like caste prejudice. They would probably get dismissed, but they did not want that. They wanted some form of an accountability mechanism, but it was never provided to them. So they went online for two things: not for revenge, as it is pointed out, by several people. One was they don't want them. They want it to stop. So they don't want any other person to go through what they went through. And the other one was to find healing in justice and accountability. And that healing in justice and accountability happened in various ways. It happened through collective writing of testimonials. Some testimonials were never even released. So some just sat in a room and wrote and spoke and cried together. Some cooked together and formed bonds which last long after the movement ended in that way. It happened through formation of collectives. I still remember one survivor said that I joined a collective of pretty badass women who supported other survivors and was pushing the institution to have more welfare mechanisms and justice mechanisms embedded within the institution. And I think the last thing I want to end on is that a lot of people ask me in conferences, talks, or even pubs, oh, you researched the Me Too movement. So what would you say is was the result of the Me Too movement? And I say the same thing every time, is that, well, movements cannot be measured by your capitalistic instruments in some ways. But also movements are not one-off. They don't just come and disappear. They're part of a much, much bigger, they are a wave in an ocean. And that, it has a history and it will have a future. So any movements, like the several online movements that we know of, such as Me Too, but the ones that we don't know of, RU reference list, Niuna Menos, so many of them across the world, they are bricks in a structure that we want to build. And because of these movements, every single day we have new feminists who are joining the cause and fighting for a better world.
Thanks, Richa. That was, and thanks all three of you. That was very inspiring and gives us lots of cause for optimism. So I'm now going to throw the floor open for questions, or comments, or any type of reflections that you have based on anything we've been discussing, or anything we really should have focused on, but we didn't quite get around to. If you're online, you're also welcome to add your questions to the chat, and Caroline is very kindly keeping an eye on that and will read out your question if needed.